Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Poison Pen podcast here. I'm Patrick. I am your science fiction fantasy selector here at the Poison Pen, and I have the great honor of introducing and talking with Hugo Award-winning writer Arkady Martine with her newest book, A Desolation Called Peace. Arkady, welcome. Thank you so much. Yay!
Thank you
Exciting.
for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
It's really you know the release of your book or the book week that you're when it comes out is always so exciting because you're sort of on this kind of whirlwind media tour, right? um, in normal times you'd be coming from bookstore to bookstore and short on sleep, signing books and meeting with everybody. Instead, you're probably slightly less short on sleep but still doing hundreds of interviews.
It's a lot, but it's a lot. So,
That's part of the fun of being a writer, is getting out
yeah.
and connecting with everybody and talking about your new book. So A Memory Called Empire was one of my favorite books of last year, and then we discussed it in our Sci Friday book club in January, so I had the opportunity to reread and touch up on that. And you won the Hugo Award for that novel.
I did.
First time out, what was that process like? What was it like, being part of that whole Sturm and Drang?
Surprising, I think. I mean, I'll be a little bit arrogant. I knew I'd written a good book. So I was very happy that other people also thought so. Um, and I had zero expectations of actually winning it. I mean, it's a debut book that very rarely happens. I haven't been, I mean, okay, I have been around the science fiction fantasy community for a while. I wrote a bunch of short fiction and I do conventions but still, I was really pleased that I got to be part of it. So I put on a fancy dress and a bunch of jewelry and good makeup and wished I was in New Zealand and rewrote my speech during the ceremony because it wasn't very good the first time. And last minute efforts are apparently a trademark. And I was shocked, I think, absolutely delighted, but completely surprised.
It's a great honor to be nominated by your peers and by the community to say this is a really, really good book, and we feel like this is one of the best books of the year. And obviously, it's like winning the Oscar first time out, right? That you get the chance to say, yes, I wrote a really, really good book this year. And I thought it was absolutely spectacular.
Thank you.
What I love about your writing is the fact that you're willing to touch on cultures that are not commonly represented within science fiction and fantasy. You have sort of that South American feel towards your character,
Mesoamerican. There's a
Mesoamerica.
lot of Mexica, of the Aztecs, that were a part of the stew of influences in A Memory Called Empire and the Teixcatlan universe in general.
Exactly. And um, and you've got that great murder mystery as well tied into it, which I really liked. It felt almost like, when I was reading through it, I felt very much almost like a John le Carre novel, where we have
Okay, you've
that
made my night.
spy espionage sort of feel to it.
Yes,
And
that's I Le Carre is a huge influence. I love his work. I love spy stories in general. I also really, really love noir. Not that A Memory Called Empire has much noir in it, but Raymond Chandler is also a deep influence. So there's this whole crime fiction, spy fiction thread to what I do and what I'm interested in.
very much so. And was that part of kind of the premise when you were coming up with Memory Called Empire, or what did you do in terms of, or how did you decide that this was going to be your plot and this was going to be your book?
Well, I started writing A Memory Called Empire, I think in the summer of 2014, and I had just finished my PhD dissertation. And clearly the obvious thing to do is to give myself another enormous project that would take years to finish. So I had never written a novel successfully before. I had made some terrible juvenilia attempts. I was pretty good at short fiction, but writing novels is hard because there are too many words on them. It takes forever. They go on so long. And I'm not good at plot. I know this sounds weird because I've figured out hacks to make me look like I'm good at plot, but I'm not innately a person who has the whole story, can figure out like, and then this will happen, and then this will happen. I come to stories with an idea, a theme, and a feeling, and often a question. And the question I really wanted to play with A Memory Called Empire was actually the question that I was still stuck on from that same PhD. I did the PhD on Byzantine history in general, but specifically on the letters of Byzantine diplomats and provincial governors on the eastern frontier, and also some Armenian provincial governors who worked for the Byzantine Empire. And a lot of what I was doing in my dissertation and in a postdoc project I did while I was writing the book actually was all about how do people deal with imperial ideology in places where it gets challenged? And how do people who are extremely vulnerable to being destroyed by an imperial ideology try to suborn it or play with it or make it theirs or make themselves its? And all of those ideas and questions from my academic work, which were why I did that academic work. I wasn't done. I certainly wasn't emotionally done. In academic work, you don't really write from a place where your impulse is emotional. You write from a place where your impulse is analytical. That's how it should be. But that doesn't mean you don't feel things about the stuff you study. You really do.
You really do. And it's a really interesting concept of what do you do. We talk about, and we learn about a lot in Arizona, I think, a lot about kind of what happens when imperialism takes over a culture. I mean, we have that associated with our Navajos and our natives, but then again, we've also got the entire, we're so close to Mexico,
Yeah.
that and Arizona was part of Mexico in that Mesoamerican sort of area. So, their culture has become part of our culture and their history is part of our history. And you go down south and you can see the remnants of imperialism kind of at its finest.
Of layers of empires. I mean, you have the Mexica, and then you have the Spanish Empire in overlaid on that. I'm in New Mexico, which you can tell by the name. I mean, I can't remember if Arizona was a state first or if we were here in New Mexico, but I know that we have only been a state for about 150 years.
Yeah, and I think, Arizona celebrated its centennial, gosh, I want to say around 1999, but I could be
Yeah.
wrong. I think we were one of the last sort of territories, though, to become both New Mexico and Arizona as states. Um, and it's really prevalent. I mean, New Mexico, one of the most beautiful states in the country, and you can go from town to town, from in between Albuquerque and Santa Fe and up to Taos, which has the
House
Taos
Pueblo.
Pueblo.
Yes.
And you hear the history from the Taos Indians about what occurred in Taos, and it's much
It's not
different than
very
maybe.
fun.
Yes.
Um, yeah, I mean, I consider the United States of America to be one of those layers of imperial culture. So there's really three in a lot of places in this part of the world that we both happen to live in. And that is, you get these very interesting sort of I mean, I'm not Latina, so I can't really speak to what it's like to
Right.
be from a conquering people who is then a conquered one. But that's an interesting space.
It is a really
But these are questions that I'm just fascinated with and themes I'm fascinated with. And I write science fiction when I'm deliberately trying not to write science fiction. It just happens to me. So logically, I wanted to explore those things
Well,
in a science fiction setting.
science fiction really lends itself, I think, to exploring a lot of cultural and philosophical ideas. I've got to say that, Memory Called Empire did it beautifully, discussing the impacts of cultural imperialism onto cultures and to subcultures. Um, and I feel like that is one of the best spaces to discuss some really hard subjects because it's almost neutral territory. We're not discussing the United States. We're not
Yeah.
discussing Europe necessarily. We can pull some of those cultures in and we can use it to sort of espouse our arguments and to philosophically discuss the problems associated within maybe our own cultures.
So, yes, and I think I said this in a Reddit AMA, but I still like it. So I'll say it again. One of the things you can do when you take a question like assimilation and cultural imperialism and being in love with a culture that is eating your culture and that you know that you should actually despise, and you take
Right.
that out of anyone's current lived experience, anyone's like precise current lived experience, and you put it into a science fictional place that doesn't have direct antecedents, um, you can get very close to something very, very sharp, close enough to cut, but not close enough to wound, is what I said on
Right.
Reddit. And I still mean that. It should hurt, but not badly enough that you can't like be okay. Um, and that's one of the things that I think there's room for in science fiction, and that I very much appreciate about the genre, about it having that kind of room. I mean, people call science fiction the literature of ideas, and when they started saying that, they meant it to be about like, and now we shall invent a machine that travels through time.
Exactly.
And the we, of course, being some white Protestant men in lab coats in the 50s. But science fiction is the literature of ideas. It is as much a literature of social science, of artistic science. It's a literature about techne, to use the Greek word, which is where we get technology, but means in Greek more like an art. So like, with that sense of practice or exploration. And I'm by training twice over a social scientist, and I'm a historian and I'm a urban planner, and now I do energy policy. So all of that, the questions that social scientists ask, how do societies work? What would happen if you changed this? To
Right.
people and their relationships with each other and their relationships with how they think of the world. You can push those as far as you like in science fiction, the same way that you can push a technological idea, a purely technological idea, though there are no such things. I mean, is a time machine not a cultural artifact?
It 100% is, and it's interesting because we do um, often think of science fiction strictly in terms of the technical, and you know, but so much of it is about the social. And an author that we recently read was Kim Stanley Robinson, and we read Aurora. And that
Mm-hmm.
was more about, I think, the people living within a spaceship traveling from one planet to the next and that sense of discovery. But he really played with the ideas of what happens when you put so many people into a small confined space. What's going to
Yeah.
happen? What's going to happen socially?
There's a really interesting antecedent to Aurora, and I don't know if Kim Stanley Robinson was thinking about it when he wrote Aurora, but a much earlier piece of science fiction called Tau Zero by Paul Anderson, which is essentially it's a generationship story, but it's an accidental generationship story. Their star drive goes wrong. They're going to live forever until the heat death of the universe, and it's horrible. But that's the only technological bit in the story. The rest of it is about people. The rest of it is about these people who had made a choice back when they were on Earth that they wanted to colonize another planet. It's a very particular and select group of people. And what happens when you lock them all into a small spaceship where they think they're going to be there for 2 years, but it turns out they're going to be there for the rest of their lives, and everything else that they thought that they would ever have access to again is over even before they noticed it was over. And I mean, the book shows its age in a lot of ways. There's there's a whole plot about babies, which drives me crazy as a person who is a cis woman and doesn't want to be defined by the wanting or not wanting of babies. But it's just, it's a gorgeous thought experiment anyway.
Exactly.
Once you like, okay, there's going to be stuff in here that's going to make me really, really angry. But leaving that aside, what else does this do? And it does some really amazing stuff. So I'd recommend it.
When a book really pulls in that emotion, and I think Memory Called Empire really does that, and your sequel, A Desolation Called Peace, does as well. And I think it's a really powerful book. Again, a little bit more of this one has a bit more of a thriller tension to it.
Well, that's interesting, because people keep telling me that Memory's the one with the thriller plot. This isn't exactly a thriller plot. I mean, this is me riffing on military science fiction. It's a pretty wide riff, like a lot of melisma, but I love military science fiction, but it's not a genre that often speaks to that social science that I'm really interested in.
Right.
So playing with that in this was something that was part of the joy of writing this. Like, okay, I really like stories about space battles and fleet politics. What if I did that?
That's exactly it. And but there's always that thriller tension, I think, whenever I think of military science fiction, military SFF. You've always got to have sort of that sort of thriller. Are they going to get through it, or are they not? Maybe
Yeah.
it's more adventure is what we're looking at in that sort of sense. Now, you had just come off of writing A Memory Called Empire, and that book took you quite a long time to write.
About 3 years, yeah, with a
Yeah,
year of not writing it in the middle.
and then you win the Hugo. I'm sure you ended up having a book contract for this, and you do a day job. So what was that like as a writer now having this time crunch to write
So
this?
actually, because publishing is strange, and also we had a pandemic, Desolation was finished in March of 2020. It was originally supposed to be published in March of 2020, but I missed a deadline because of the aforementioned day job.
Right.
So I got first bumped to, because I missed the deadline, to like October-ish
Mm-hmm.
of last year. And then because pandemic, a lot of people got shifted.
Yeah.
So we shifted over again. And this is just a thing that happens in publishing. Like the lag time between when you finish the book and when the book is out. I mean, a year is not unusual. 2 years is pushing it a bit, but still.
Right.
But you're not wrong about the difference between writing a book when you don't have a contract and when you do. So I had about a year and a bit on my initial deadline from the point when I sold A Memory Called Empire, the point where I was supposed to hand in A Desolation Called Peace, because I sold the book as a duology with the promise that I would write another one and hand it in. And I mean, the terrible secret of me is that A Memory Called Empire really is my first novel. I don't have a million trunk novels. I pulled it off once and I had no idea how I did it. And then I had to do it again. My very good friend Elizabeth Barrer likes to say that you don't know how to write a novel. You have know how to write the novel you're writing. You learn how to write the novel you're writing. I think she may have gotten that from someone else, but I love it. And it's comforting when very little else is, about the fact that writing is a process of figuring out a skill set every single time. And I think if it wasn't, I wouldn't be doing it justice. Like, I want to push myself with every book I do.
Absolutely. Um, and I'm finding um, what's really interesting is that I guess I'm going to kind of segue in a minute, is that a lot of women are writing really, really good science fiction.
They've been
And
doing it for quite some time.
they have been, but I don't think they've been always getting the credit that they deserve.
That's very true.
So, but now we're seeing kind of this plethora. And one of the things that I really think I prefer as a reader is the fact that um, I just feel like character from a lot of female writers is so much stronger. And one of the things that I really liked about A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace is your examination of character, and Mahit and her guide, and I'm blinking,
Please
Sweetgrass.
speak, Grass.
Yes, are just such wonderful characters. Um, they really shine on the page and really become
You.
fully and fully three-dimensional people. And I've got to applaud you for that, because sometimes that's, I think it's probably hard to do in writing in general.
Well, I think, well, yeah, character work is hard, like everything else. I come from, I mean, I got my chops in writing because I never thought for years and years and years that I would like do writing professionally. It was a hobby. I read a lot of fan fiction in my teens and 20s, and that teaches you character. You have to be able to evoke the character that people already know. And you have to do it well enough that it's believable in a completely different story that you're telling. So if you weren't good at it before, you're going to be good at it after a while. Um, I also very much believe that plot is character, that what happens is in a book or in any story really is the result of the interaction between a I could get really abstract here, between an animate intelligence and a situation, because I do think you can have a plot which has only one point of view and a landscape, and that's enough interaction. But most of the time, you bounce in the imaginary people off each other and see what happens. And at least for me and how I do plot construction, a lot of it has to do with the emotional tenor of conversations and what that would push people to do. And so like the difference between having the same conversation with someone you trust and someone who you think is about to screw you over, even if it's exactly the same dialogue, um, that changes what that character will do in the next scene. Are they obsessively rethinking everything they just said and worrying about it? Or are they serene and confident in their decisions? And that's kind of how I get through line through a book, is you link up the emotional states.
That's really interesting. And so, what were you thinking with Mahit when she was trying to solve the murder, and as you were kind of solving it with her in A Memory Called Empire?
Um, I mean, that's a very broad question. So Mahit is the kind of character I really love to write. As in, she is just smart enough and just competent enough to get in an enormous amount of trouble. I love that kind of character. They're really fun. Um, and she's also, and this is where you can see the influence of Le Carre and also C.J. Cherry, who's one of my favorite science fiction writers, on my work. She's incredibly internal. And this is one of the things that I think makes A Memory Called Empire work, but also made it really hard to write, because there's only one point of view And that particular point of view is constantly reanalyzing itself. So it can feel kind of claustrophobic, which was on purpose, but made I remember very distinctly this moment where I was in the middle of the book, sort of about the 2/3 mark, and writing a scene and trying to convince myself it was all right to let my character know something, like for real, like 100% that's true. She knows it now, as opposed to keeping things ambiguous and evaluatory. Um, it was, I still find it funny that I had that moment because I had gotten that deep into her head that almost I didn't trust myself.
Well, and as a writer, I mean, you can torture your character as much as you want, or you can, you know, let them kind of come across things kind of naturally. And sometimes you just end up realizing as you live in their head long enough, hey, they really do know more than maybe what I was originally thinking.
A Memory Called Empire is an information control novel. It is all about who knows what when,
Hmm.
which is also about the audience, the reader. The reader is one of those people who has to like know particular things at particular moments. And keeping the reader informed and keeping the reader, letting the reader feel like the world is as big and as expansive as it is, was one of the big tasks I had to do when I edited the book, was to get that expansiveness in without losing the internality and claustrophobia of my single point of view.
Right.
Um, and that was a real challenge, and definitely, I guess I call it a skill test. My editor, who's brilliant, Devi Pillai at Tor Books, she gave me in my edit letter for A Memory Called Empire 5 bullet points of things I should probably address and an instruction. And the instruction was, go write the other 40,000 words of the book, Arkady. The problem was she was right. And then I did. The book I sold was about 95,000 words long.
So, and that's one of the people often don't realize how much of creating a book is a it's a labor of your love, especially when you're first getting out on the page, and then it's a labor of your editor to tell you kind of the honest truths of your book that you need to go what you could do to make it an even stronger novel.
Mhm.
And it takes a village. It's a very collaborative part of the writing process.
It
And
really is.
probably one of the hardest parts of it is to, kind of digest and figure out what they tell you is right and what you might be able to say, you know what, I don't agree with you. Or
Mm.
maybe you don't like it, but you have to agree with it.
Yeah. For me, and I'm very lucky in my editor in that, as previously stated, she is brilliant. Um, I have a lot of case 1 and case 3, and very little of case 2 on the editorial pass. So a lot of, oh hell, I really should have done that, shouldn't I? And a lot of, well, I really don't want to do that, and I don't like it, but you're right, damn it. It's in copy edits where I run into case 2. The nope, nope, sorry, no, I'm not going to explain that. I did explain that and you didn't get it, and that's your fault, which is rude, but hey.
It's true. And, honestly, I mean, one of the hardest parts about science fiction fantasy, especially where you're taking it where you have with kind of this Mesoamerican bent, I'm sure that there were challenges with, Tehlani Empire, the different words that you've chosen, the language that you've done, and where certain things lie.
Not so much with that, because I mean, science fiction, I think people who work in editing and copy editing and production in science fiction and fantasy are pretty used to weird words. Um, but well, I'll give you an example from Desolation, and this is a thank God for copy editors example. I lost a month of time in the book. It disappeared. I had basically mislocated an entire month of travel time, that is vitally important to the plot, because a lot of the plot in Desolation has to do with not who knows what, but when do they know it?
Right.
And the timing is, and it was on the second round of copy edits, so the book had been laid out. Like I'm looking at a perfectly laid out, like not a bound manuscript, but like a stack of paper with the font and the little detailings, and it's like ready to go. And I'm doing, the copy editor is doing final copy check, and the copy editor sends this email saying the timing doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at it and I went, oh my God, it doesn't. It was horrible. And I had to redo it. Not the book, obviously, but there was quite a lot of very careful surgery to make that actually function.
Well, and that's one of the challenges. That's why you always need several readers to kind of read through the book, because where it may seem obvious to you or I as the writer writing it, because you've lived in this world for, as you've been writing this book and pouring it out onto the page, and then, you know, you need somebody who hasn't been living in that world to kind of come in and help
Yeah.
clarify.
Most of the time, my wife Vivian, who is a brilliant writer her own self, her trilogy is the Greta Helsing trilogy from Orbit Books. She's my first reader for everything, and she is also my sort of translator. She will tell me when I have been obscure to the point of nihilism. And how to fix it. And also anything that's good about my spaceship physics is her, because she's way better at aviation than I am, both general and space. But you need someone who can tell you when you're too far down inside your own head.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody has those their beta readers, and shout out to Vivian. I really like her books too. So
I'll tell her.
like the Greta Helsing series, I'm a sucker for monster movies and books with great monsters. She does a marvelous job with both of those, and a kick-ass heroine. So, anyways, um, so but yeah, we do need those beta readers that sort of help us. Um, Kind of figure out what's going on. And we have a lot of uh, apologies if you hear a dog in the background. That's my dog barking at people passing by the front of the store. Um, uh, but we need those people that kind of ground us and ground our writing and help us see that. When you're done with the book, do you close it and leave it alone for a couple weeks before going back to it?
I should. Um, I have really high risk tolerance, and I'm the sort of person who submits things before they're edited. Like I'm that asshole. The, oh, I wrote it. I'm done. I finished a thing because I finished it. It must be good, because finishing things is the hardest. So if I actually manage to finish it, well, surely I can just like toss this into the wild. The horrible thing is it works half the time. But then I'm not a draft. I don't have a million drafts. I do a lot of editing in process. So I'll go back while I'm in the middle of the book and redo the first half. So there's not really ever sort of a first draft and a second draft. There's iterative pieces for me.
Doesn't that sort of come from being a academic as well? I think that for those of us who are used to having to write, in my undergraduate and graduate school, I had to write a lot of papers. So just getting it done, you have that only that time.
Maybe
To write it.
it's something like that. And it's also like, I don't know, there's so much serotonin in finishing a thing. Maybe I'm just writing that when I submit stuff. But I think the only reason that it works for me is that because I have this very sort of convoluted editing process while I'm writing. And I also write in order, which I'm incredibly envious of people who can skip around. But for me, it doesn't work. So when I go back and change things, it really is an iteration. Like I'll go to the point where I want to shift something major or add a scene, and then I have to read from the point where I added something all the way through to where I have no more text and make sure I've normalized it all. So that can be an extensive process.
It sounds like an exhausting process too, you know.
I guess one of the weird things about it is that it means that I kind of forget what wasn't in the book to begin with. Like the edits become very seamless in my mental conception of the book
Mhm.
because I've done this kind of overwrite.
So what inspired you to do the Mesoamerican theme?
So the surface of Teixcatlan is very Mesoamerican, but the deep heart of Teixcatlan, the ideological heart of Teixcatlan is the Byzantine Empire, which is what I am most acquainted with if we're picking medieval and early modern imperial forms, considering I spent 10 years of my life looking at it. But one of the things about Byzantium, a very specific thing about Byzantium, is that not only is it a universalist empire, it thinks it's the center of the world, one empire, one emperor, an ideology of conquest and like rightful conquest, but it's also a Christian empire, very specifically, and that's incredibly important to how Byzantium works. And I didn't want to write a book that was dependent on Christianity. That wasn't what the questions that would create weren't the ones I wanted to explore. So I wanted to pull away from monotheism in general. So I looked around at contemporaneous, equally complicated, equally focused on spectacle, history, ritual, imperial forms. And I was like, oh, well, the Aztecs work really well here. And also, I love the Popol which is, that's Mayan actually. But I really, really love Mesoamerican mythology and history. And I have for a very long time. And it ended up meshing incredibly well with the aesthetic of what I wanted to create, because I wanted to create this empire that was incredibly lush, that was really like decadent's the wrong word, but that could be interpreted as decadent by someone who wasn't in it. And that actually is from Byzantium. I mean, that's why we call like the thing the decadent East, to be incredibly 19th century German. But it turned out that this lushness and richness and visual culture that I wanted to have for Teixcatlan was something that was woven all through my research into Mesoamerican cultures. And it was such a weirdly easy mesh. And I mean, there's some other stuff in there too. There's the Pax Mongolica, the Peace of the Mongols, and there's a hell of a lot of American cultural imperialism. I mean, there's this soap opera in these and comics.
There really are. I mean, but that's in history. I mean, you get some of the best soap operas ever. I mean, when you think about, um, the British royal lineage and King Henry VIII and that entire, and War of the Roses. I mean, there's so much drama and there's so much of a level of soap opera
I was
associated
actually
with.
thinking that when I was writing the epigrams, like there's actually one that's a soap opera script. Well, it's but that's you're not wrong. There's also like, I mean, it's space opera, which is from soap opera, which is actually from horse opera, which is the first bit. Horse opera was basically what a Western was, except a Western with romances.
Mhm.
And that can trace that line right through Star Wars, which is functionally a Western
It
in a
is.
lot of
It is.
ways,
Yeah.
and into sort of the classic space opera, and then into the, I'd say like the modern flourishing of space opera that we're in right now. I'm certainly not the only one who's playing with this. It's a great um, arena at the moment.
Um, and yes. And so, gosh, in terms of that, um, because it is such a great arena, do you think that you're going to keep with sort of the space opera? Are you going to, as a writer, change direction? Are you going to try something a little bit different the next time?
Well, the projects I'm working on now are not in Tixkalan, but I'm definitely not done with Tixkalan. Both are true. Um, so A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace are a duology. They're a unit, that they're a closed unit. That doesn't mean there won't ever be any more Mahit. There probably will be more Mahit. I have more things to say about Mahit. Um, and there's definitely a lot more of Tixkalan I want to do. Like I could probably write Tixkalan books for the rest of my career and be happy about it. But it's certainly not the only thing I want to do. The book I'm working on now, the one I'm almost finished with, is a architectural murder mystery novella with an AI in it. And the next novel length project is kind of my take on cyberpunk, and is about water rights and an arson investigator. So it's, but I'm never going to be done with space opera. I love space opera and I love writing it. But like I said at the beginning of our conversation, if I'm not pushing myself, I'm not learning, I'm not doing as well as I can.
That's exactly it. It's part of the fun of, and I think that's why I like reading so much science fiction and fantasy. As a reader, I feel like I push myself into different directions and different thoughts. Learn about different technologies. Definitely learn about different cultures. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is the fact that, um, lately authors like yourself and Rebecca Roanhorse are beginning to bring in that Mesoamerican,
Rebecca Roanhorse is
South
brilliant.
African, yeah,
Just
South American, sorry.
just absolutely brilliant. Her most recent book, Black Sun, blew my mind. And I highly recommend it to pretty much everybody, but also very much for people who like my work. It's a epic fantasy, but I think epic fantasy and space opera are actually very weird sorts of mirror twins.
They
There's
are.
a lot there that, or at least the epic fantasy that I love, has all the same kinds of high drama, high politics, high consequence stuff that I love in the space opera I love. Um, and they can have very similar kinds of plots as well.
There is. And, it takes a certain level of world building.
Yeah.
And in both of them, there are very much sets of rules that you have to follow. And science fiction, obviously you're more bound to physics and technology, sort of. And
Just don't
then,
break your own rules. That's all.
I, I often have to say, and then fantasy, you have to set up your own rules associated with magic, and the systems if you're going to do a fantasy base or a magic based system. And then, of course, there are some authors like Ellie Modesset who sort of blurred those lines between
Mm-hmm.
technology and magic. So, but they are very similar in terms of sort of your rule base and your rule set. So, coming to that, when you were creating Tehelani, what sort of planning did you do in terms of planning out your world? Did you write a lot?
Uh-uh. Nope.
No.
I'm not one of those people. I don't have a world building Bible. I eventually like ended up with a glossary. But that was constructed as I wrote, and it was started out as I have got to keep track of what I've said all of these people do. Because I was just inventing characters because I needed them and I couldn't keep track of them anymore. So I started writing them down. Um, I'm a very rule of cool person. I like, I want things to feel a certain way or be interesting in a certain way. And then I also want that decision to be well backed up with enough science, enough world building that it's plausible. And if I set a rule, I'm never going to change it. I'm never going to break my own rules.
Right.
So, I mean, a good example, again from Desolation. This is not a spoiler. Kelp beer cannot be a spoiler. At one point, a character experiences kelp beer and wishes that she hadn't. I wanted to figure out what kind of beer you could grow on LaSalle Station. Like, what kind of alcohol do you have? Because clearly there's some. What can you grow hydroponically?
Mhm.
And I mean, first I came up with, okay, you're going to end up with a bunch of vodka because you can just refine that out of almost any grain. And but wheat is really hard to do hydroponically, at least at scale. So what's your grain instead? I mean, if you're growing rice, and I know they eat a lot of rice, like that's not really beer. I mean, there is rice beer, but it's not. It doesn't taste like beer. Not
Right.
that kelp beer tastes like beer. But so I went down a huge rabbit hole of research to figure out how I could get beer because I wanted there to be beer, not because I wanted to know what kind of plants grew on LaSalle Station. So it's that direction. You start with, I want this to be true, and then I have to figure out how that could be true, and make sure that what I've defined as true never changes after that. And I started doing that with the jump gates, actually, which is the method of faster than light travel, which is the one that I'm using in this whole universe, which was I needed my giant space empire to behave more like a medieval empire
Mhm.
and less like one that could just randomly appear out of nowhere, because that would really screw up the careful balance of empire and periphery I was trying to draw. It's like, okay, I have to invent the space equivalent of a narrow mountain pass to protect people behind. How do I do that? Okay, I have a single thread jump gate, and that became part of the fabric of the universe because I needed it to behave a certain way. And then once you've set up something like that, you get to have a lot of fun with it. The jump gates create a lot of the plot in A Desolation Called Peace.
Yes.
And that plot would not have gone down that way had I not designed them for a completely different reason in book one.
That is fascinating. That is so fascinating. So, we've been talking a lot about jump gates. We've been talking a lot about your writing process. I apologize. We haven't really gotten into A Desolation Called Peace. Can you
Hey.
tell the audience a little bit about, so we know that it's a military thriller, but other than that, give us a little bit of a elevator speech on what's going on with Mahit and A Desolation.
So, A Desolation Called Peace takes place about 3 months. There's that month that I lost briefly. After the events of A Memory Called Empire. So Mahit has gone back to LaSalle Station. And the events at the end of A Memory Called Empire have had some major geopolitical effects. So that mysterious enemy has become still very mysterious, but definitely much more of an enemy. And Tixcalan is committed to at least a fairly major border war, if not an all-out assault. And unlike A Memory Called Empire, Desolation Called Peace has 4 points of view. One of them is Mahit, one of them is Three Seagrass, one of them is the general who is in control of the Imperial fleet. Her name is Nine Hibiscus. And one of them is the 11-year-old clone of the Emperor. And he might be my favorite point of view to write. His name is Eight Antidote, and he gets rather involved in several things. But I've been teasing this book for a while by saying that it's got interstellar mail fraud in it, and that's part of his plot. Really, what the book is about, though, is this. It's another one of those big questions that I'm obsessed with and horrified by, the same way I'm obsessed and horrified by questions about like assimilation to imperial cultures. And that's, can you communicate with something that is not comprehensible to you? It's something that you can't communicate with a person. Is that possible? And I wanted to sort of take that idea and flay it open and look at all of its ugly insides and see if there was an answer that I could come up with, that I could convince myself about, that human beings could look at something that was so profoundly other to them that the very existence and experience of that other was threatening, and not make the decision to engage in acts of apocalyptic violence. I wanted to see if I could figure that out. And there is a answer in this book. It's certainly not the only one. And it might be more optimistic than I really am. But I like where it ended up. And that question is really the animating question of the book. Like,
That's interesting that you say it's more optimistic than you feel like you really are.
Maybe, I don't know. It depends on the week.
Exactly. Well, we've just, the world has gone through this entire upheaval, with COVID and everything. So sometimes it's hard to feel a little optimistic. As a writer, how have you been dealing with the whole COVID-19? Has it been?
I hate the pandemic. It is not productive. All of that nonsense about having lots of time to write does not work when you cannot leave your house. Basically, it's just, I will be very, very happy when I can go to coffee shops, because I used to go to a coffee shop after a day job and you either write 500 words or you spend 1 hour, or whichever comes first. And that was how I wrote books while I first was in school and then working. And it is real different when you work in your house and also try to write in your house, which is how I've been for about a year.
Charlene Harris called it COVID brain, and a lot of writers have, where she said it's really been hard and a struggle to feel artistic and to be able to feel like you can really get in there. I would say probably for you too, going to a coffee shop, you can write, and if you got stuck, you could people watch, right? And get kind of an idea behind character and think about, have that sort of as an inspiration.
For me, it is very much about, there are places for different tasks, and having that differentiation. I have ADHD, and doing task-based, like location-based tasks is one of the ways that I've always managed to get focused. So not having that has been really difficult. And it's something that I'm very much looking forward to not having to deal with soon. Yeah.
As a bookstore, it's been really hard because we have staff members who are older, definitely more at risk. So our store owner, in her, I think, wisdom, said, you know what, let's close for a while. We'll do curbside pickup for a while, and then we'll start reopening as things start to go down. And certainly now we're open about half the day, and then we're curbside pickup the other half of the day. I've got to say, one of the things I really miss in terms of being a bookseller is to talk with our customers.
Oh yeah.
Because they are wonderful in terms of letting you know what's good out there, what we need to read. And on top of that, sort of a livelihood and a liveliness to the store. And definitely having authors like you who come,
I would love to come by. I mean,
absolutely.
I'm close to you guys. It wouldn't take very long. Well, I mean, it would take a while if I drove, but
Yeah, I mean, I know where you're at in terms of the United States, and take you a little bit of time, but at the same time, we have a few other mystery writers who are in your area that actually use us kind of as their home-based bookstore. So that's sort of nice, and we miss seeing people on a regular basis. Come on in and sign and personalize and have these big events. But the nice thing is that we get to talk to you virtually, at least. I did have a couple questions.
Sure.
One of our customers, Anastasia, says you look fabulous.
Thank you.
And she wants to know where you got the top, because
I just discovered this. So this came from a shop called The Kit, and I am afraid to say that I got sucked in by an Instagram ad. But I never see like clothing that has this much elaborate pattern and color in it. And I love that. I'm kind of a clothes horse. So it's called The Kit, and annoyingly expensive, which is why I only have one of these, but worth it.
You got to splurge sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Um, in terms of another one of our customers really liked your writing style and your cadence. Um, in terms of how you write and sort of um, the cadence of your text. Do you just write the way you're thinking, or is
Yeah.
there a very
I mean, cadence is incredibly important to me. It's one of the reasons that while I know for a fact that the audiobook versions of my books are brilliant, because many people who have listened to them have told me so, I can't listen to audio of my own work because everyone has a different speaking cadence. But I hear it when I write. My whole family are musicians aside from me, so that's part of it. And I mean, I'm a singer and I played piano for years and years and years. So there, rhythm and sound and um, phrasing is a lot of how I think about language, and so it's both very organic and very deliberate, I guess, as an answer.
that's well we it's important because I think that your books really are incredibly lyrical. um, a Desolation Called Peace really starts out with a bang, but it starts
Yeah,
out with an incredibly lyrical bang, I've got to say.
I was maybe planning on reading that bit. We'll see if we have time. It takes about 2 minutes to read if we have time for it because it's fun.
If you want to share it,
Yeah,
Arkady,
sure.
you're
This
more
is the
than welcome.
prologues. It's the very first bit of the book, and it is not very long at all. To think, not language. To not think language. To think we, and not have a tongue sound or cry for its crystalline depths. To have discarded tongue sounds where they are unsuitable. To think as a person, and not as a wantful voice, not as a blank-eyed hungering beast, not as a child thinks with only its own self and the cries of its mouth for company. To look outward from the 2-ring or 3-ring of one of our star flyers and see every pinpoint light, every fusion heart star. To see the pattern these stars make in our eyes, reflecting the pattern of our eyes in the dark on the old planet. How our eyeshine glowed in the dirt home, the blood home, how we closed them and were invisible. Dark scavengers, secret hunters. How our star flyers glow in the void home, the light home of us. How we slip sideways like a closing eye and are invisible. To think as a person with the singing fractal swarm of we, and see these places that we have not yet scavenged, not yet torn open, claws as delicate as surgeon scalpels for their secrets. Oh, the other hunger, the hunger of we that is nothing to do with the body, the hunger of we to reach out. This body or that body, flesh full of the genes for strength and savagery, flesh full of the genes for patience and pattern spotting. This body, a curious body, an observer body, trained well for celestial navigation and surveying, its claws laced through with the filaments of metal that allow it to sing not only to we, but to any starflyer it touches. This body, a body that almost did not become we, almost became meat instead, but is we and sings we, and is a body for making other bodies meet and for making other bodies with itself. This body full of kits and clever with its hands on the triggers of a starflyer's energy cannons. These bodies singing in the we, singing together of the flesh of bodies who are not we, but have built starflyers and energy cannons. Bodies who are meat and cannot sing. Bodies who think language, who cry with their mouths and leak water from their eyes, who are clawless but vicious in their own hunger to reach out, who have touched so much of the void home already and dwell in it, and have come so very close to the jump gates behind which are all of our blood homes, new and old. These bodies sing. The clever meat dies like every other meat, like we do, but it does not remember what its dead meat knew. So we have brought down our sibling bodies onto one of their planets, not a blood home, but a dirt home full of resources to scavenge, and we have rendered them up for usage, the meat and the resources both. To sing hunger satisfied, to sing understanding. Except another body provides counterpoint, a dissonant chord. This body, a curious body, an observer body, a stubborn and patrolling body, who has slipped sideways in and out of vision in the same sector of void for lo these many cycles, and remains a curious body even so. This body sings in the we, sings of a few clever meat bodies that do remember what their dead meat knew. But not all of them, not all the same knowing, not like the singing of the we. To think of a we that fragments, that does not flock, that remembers but could not hold the shape of a murmuration. We sing disturbance and we sing the hunger of reaching out to think of fragmentation. We sing too, what does this clever meat have that we do not? What singing is their singing that we cannot hear? And we send our starflyers whirling, whirling close, close enough to taste. So that's the
If we had
beginning.
an audience, you would have a huge level of clapping. A beautiful first introduction to A Desolation Called Peace. One I actually read about 3 times because I thought that it was such a brilliant beginning. And one that took me a little bit of time to work my brain around. I'm like, okay, I have to work a little bit through this, and it was well worth it. Um,
It is a challenge, but it's also a promise. Like, if you're willing to jump over this hurdle, oh, do I have things to show you?
Anastasia, who happened to have asked about your book or about your topic, excuse me, she says, "Would you ever consider writing a prequel about Iskander and his times in the Empire and falling in love?"
Mm.
He adores Iskander.
I mean, I adore Iskander, but Iskander is, dear Anastasia, Iskander's an asshole. You don't want to spend that much time with him, and neither do I. I mean, I adore him, but if I do write a prequel, it is likely to be a 19 ads prequel, which doesn't mean Iskander won't be in it.
Interesting. Well, to sort of end, we've been talking, and it's hard to believe, an hour, a little over an hour. This has been so much fun. I'm really curious in terms of, I know you're really busy working, you're really busy writing, but what are you and Vivian doing for fun while you're kind of locked in this COVID pattern?
We watch terrible television for fun, like as terrible as you can get. Uh, Sometimes not as terrible as one expects. There was this really great thing on Netflix about people who operate like equipment that fixes car wrecks, like pulls car wrecks off roads, and we watched all of that. Uh, that and we cook a lot together. Both of us really love different cuisines and do them for each other. But I mean, I think we both really, really miss restaurants and museums and just being us in the world, and also like sci-fi conventions, because we used to go to like 3 or 4 a year, and I miss seeing people. Miss being with her, with people.
I really, one of my favorite things to do here is Phoenix Fan Fest, which has changed its name numerous times, partly
Was
because
it Phoenix Comic Con or was that something
it
else?
was Phoenix Comic Con, and then there was a whole thing about using the term Comic Con. Um,
Okay. I was there one time, like I think 2014. There were too
yeah,
many people.
there are a lot of people that show up to these events, and I've always got to say it's a lot of fun because there's so many different writers who come.
Hmm.
And so one of my favorite things to do is, rather than to host an event, is just to come in and sit and allow somebody else to moderate and kind of enjoy it that way. Um, And I've got to say, I really miss that. I miss the crowds. I miss the showrooms and the convention
Yeah.
floor. Um, I miss being with my nerdy friends and nerdy people.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah, that was the best. It really was. So I agree with you. I've got to say that I've been watching too much occasional trashy television as well, which sometimes you need.
You need trashy television, especially if you're, well, I mean, like both of us, we write a lot, and being creative sometimes means you don't want to put someone else's story in your head. And at least for me, with I write a lot for my day job too. I write analysis, and oh my God, I don't want any narrative. I would like pretty people doing stupid things. Thank you. That's all.
I agree with you. I'm a business analyst during the day. So, when I'm not having to code something or try to solve a problem, sometimes below deck, which is terrible television, but really a lot of fun, about pretty people on yachts with rich people who are behaving badly.
What
Sometimes
to
is a
do?
lot of fun. Yeah, absolutely. Arkady, it's so wonderful to have you. And really, when things open up, I really hope that you and Vivian can come on down and hang out with us for an
We'd
afternoon,
love to.
except in the summertime, which I don't want to
Yes, I
expose
would.
you to.
I have been in Arizona in the summer. I did that for 3 months. It nearly killed me. I will come in the winter.
Absolutely. And we'll be glad to have you here. To our audience, thank you so much for coming. Either of us wouldn't be here without you. So, first of all, thank you for watching. Um, the first 3 weeks of Arkady's books and book sales are super important. So, please, however you purchase the books, we will be getting in signed book plates from Arkady. Um, but feel free to wherever you get our books, just buy, vote with your dollar, um, because that's really important. And to all of you, thank you so much. Arkady, I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. All right, everybody, have a great night, and we'll talk to you soon. All right.